Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. It's Christmas! Merry Christmas and happy whatever else you might celebrate. But we don't have time for pleasantries today, because I've got a surprise episode of utterly pointless comparisons here. Earlier this week, I looked at the arcade and Genesis versions of Hellfire. Well today, I figured I'd follow that up with a look at the arcade versus the PC Engine Super CD version of Hellfire. You're watching the opening cutscene from that version of the game right now. Here's the hardware specs for each system while I give you a short version of the info for each game. Arcade Hellfire was developed by Toaplan and published by Taito in several regions in 1989. It's a tough-as-nails two-player shooter, or shmup, with 6 levels, the ability to change your firing directions, and lots of levels of firepower. It's a good, but not great game in the arcade. The excellent Genesis port, which you hopefully saw in my video a few days ago, was released less than a year later. Another year later still, NEC released a version of Hellfire for the PC Engine Super CD called Hellfire S in Japan only. How is it? It's aight. The game has a lot of common PC Engine issues. All the parallax scrolling from the arcade game is gone, the sound effects are really weird, and more things like that. It's got a newly arranged Red Book audio soundtrack, which I'll talk about during the comparison, and there's a few semi-animated cutscenes including this opening with a girl that sleeps naked in front of a video phone, yet is shocked when a call comes in. Anyway, let's move on. As far as recording methodology goes this time around, I did still use save states in both versions to keep the gameplay in sync as close as I could. Although I will note that the PC Engine version of Hellfire is super easy compared to the other versions. And that's about it, I guess. Let's get on with it. Alright, here we go. So this is the same playthrough of the arcade version that you saw in the Genesis version in the last episode. As things kick off here, we can see the Starfield in the PC Engine CD version is very simplified. It's even more simplified than what we saw in the Genesis version of Stage 1, which again is kind of a mystery since the whole swirling, nebulae are visible in the last level in the PC Engine version. So I don't know why they're removed from the first level here. And notice something wrong yet? Yeah, here it is. No parallax scrolling of any kind in this version. And the other thing I will mention, and it drives me nuts in this version, the sound effects in the PC Engine CD version of Hellfire are terrible. It sounds like they took some of the cutesy-wootsy sounds from maybe Galaga 88 and just threw them into this. They do not fit this game at all. Now, as you can see, we get into the first area proper. The background is still very simplified on the PC Engine compared to the arcade version. It doesn't look as unique when compared to the arcade version as the Genesis version did, and the colors are a little bit closer to the arcade, but it's still really not all that close. Kind of surprising, really. There's no reason for it not to be. You will notice things get a little out of sync even fairly early on here. And that's primarily because in the arcade version, pretty much every time you fire your fully powered up laser, the game slows down for a split second. That doesn't happen in the home version of either system, either for the Genesis or the PC Engine Super CD, so they both tend to get ahead of the arcade version when you're watching them side by side. One other thing I'll mention here is the Red Book audio soundtrack that you just heard in the PC Engine CD version. I'm not the biggest fan of this soundtrack. For the first level here, it's alright, it's not bad, but when I hear Hellfire and its soundtrack either on the arcade or Genesis versions, I picture something of a heavy metal, electric guitar, very heavy distortion style soundtrack, right? For this version, it sounds more like a 90s anime than it does anything else. And I just don't think that fits the gameplay here. Now I'm allowing it to get out of sync a bit. As a colorblind individual, which I've mentioned before, Sometimes I find it hard to see bullets on backgrounds, and this is one of those cases on the PC Engine version. I mean, I can barely see those things that I managed to dodge. Now, unlike the Genesis version, the ship looks a little more similar to the arcade version here, and the thrusters work more like the arcade one. If you remember in the Genesis video, its version of this ship looked a lot different and was actually animated. Plus, in the Genesis, we had the super fast-moving backgrounds whenever you fight bosses. We do not get those in the PC Engine CD version. And when you look at the firepower in the PC Engine CD version, you might think, oh, that's just like the arcade version. But it's not. Because when you fire straight ahead or backwards in the arcade version, you can fire 2 volleys of 3 lasers at a time and have a total of 6 lasers on screen. In the PC Engine CD version, when you're firing either forward or backward, you can only have 3 lasers on screen at once. As we see here on PC Engine also, they did simplify the background quite a bit, and they really changed up the colors. Enemy patterns are mostly intact. You may not have noticed it too much yet, but there is quite a bit of flicker in this PC Engine CD version. There's been some of it already, but you'll see more of it as the game goes along. I'll also mention that, much like the Genesis port of the game, this version has a shield, except in this version it absorbs 2 hits instead of 1. Almost at the end of level 1 here. Here's our boss on PC Engine. As you can see, it's quite a bit simplified from both the arcade and Genesis ports, and there's quite a lot of flicker on it. And, I mean, the bosses in this PC Engine version are all laughably easy. If you reach a boss fully powered up, you are going to destroy it. You will completely wreck it with just a couple of hits, sometimes 3 maybe. Now we have another cutscene on PC Engine at the end of the first level, but they don't have these at the end of every level. It's just a regular. Every now and then, you finish a level, you get a cutscene. Other times, the next level will just start right away. Very inconsistent. Because of that, on PC Engine CD, they've also done away with this little between level thing, you know, with your stage cleared info that we saw in both the arcade and Genesis ports. Alright, with Stage 2, we can see we've got kind of a different color choice here on PC Engine, and the pyramid is missing the Sphinx, just like on the Genesis port. We'll mention that the sky looks a little nicer on the PC Engine CD version as compared to the Genesis game. The arcade one still looks better than both of them in that regard. Now, you may be wondering what you're listening to here on the PC Engine version, because it doesn't sound anything like the Level 2 song from the arcade or Genesis versions. And that's because it's really not. You see, in their infinite wisdom, NEC decided that they should use the Stage 4 music in Stage 2 and the Stage 2 music in Stage 4. So they took the very Egyptian-sounding song for Stage 2 and moved it to Stage 4, and took the very distinctly non-Egyptian-sounding song from Stage 4 and moved it to Stage 2. Why did they do this? I have no idea, and it makes no sense, and it just does not fit. Aside from that, while the Stage 4 music in the arcade version and Genesis versions is really good, this Red Book audio version I just don't like. I mean, it's missing the essence of the song, and it doesn't have the energy of the original. It's just kind of weird and dull, and it's too brassy. Where's all the guitars? We should have big, crunchy distortion guitars. Here I had to pause it on PC Engine there because, like I mentioned earlier, it ended up getting way ahead of the arcade one, because the arcade one's got all that slowdown when you fire your fully powered up laser. See here again that on PC Engine Super CD we've got an extremely simplified background. The enemies in here fire a lot less. Even so, you will still see occasional flicker here. And look at all the flicker you're going to see on this part. That G symbol, by the way, is the shield in this one. I don't have much to say on this part. I mean, the statues that are in the rocks here look better in the arcade one. They're a little more detailed. Not a huge difference, but it's noticeable. I don't know if I like the extra vibrant colors on PC Engine CD on this versus the arcade. I don't know, it looks too vibrant. And then here, as we get into this section, on the PC Engine CD, they radically simplified it. Now on the Genesis version, they slightly simplified that pattern that you see in the background in the arcade game. In the PC Engine version, they took it out entirely and just replaced it with this dumb cage. Again, is there an explanation for why they did that? If there is, I can't think of one. I mean, if they ran out of memory for the tiles, surely they could have swapped out tiles from earlier in the stage that they weren't using anymore. Notice the windows in the PC Engine port are a bit smaller than the ones in the arcade one. And those bricks at the top and bottom of the stage are a lot vertically taller on PC Engine versus the arcade, which is a level of slightly more claustrophobic feel. And much like with the Genesis port, I will say at least they got the statues pretty much spot on in this version. One thing I will mention in the PC Engine's favor versus the Genesis port is that it doesn't have vertical scrolling to see the whole screen. So you can see the whole play area without having to scroll up or down. Now much like the Genesis port, the sarcophagus isn't fully detailed like it is in the arcade game. The bottom is less detailed on PC Engine. And then you can see again, the boss only took a couple of hits for it to go down. All the bosses in this version are just so incredibly easy. And the line transition effect in the PC Engine version at the end of a stage is pretty nice. It's not the same as the arcade, but it's something. But when you start a new stage, it doesn't usually do that transition, it just begins. There's not even a fade in, it's just there. Like that. See what I mean? And again for this stage on PC Engine, the colors are a little overly vibrant, especially in the rocks on the ground. And just the red of the whatever it is that's inside the glass. It's just too bright. This is one level where losing the parallax is super obvious and really gives this game a kind of inferior feeling on the PC Engine version. This seems more like something you'd see on NES. Now obviously we have a lot more sprites in this than an NES game and they're a little bit larger, but whenever you see they don't even bother to try with any kind of parallax, that's always a problem. I mean, what they could have done here in this level is had the screen split in two, so half of it was scrolling at a different speed, and then for these things that stick up like this, they could have just made those sprites and had them scroll by at a different speed. And we would have had a nice little parallax illusion. And the only thing they would have had to have done is change the little vine things that drip down and maybe stop them at the halfway point. Look at all the flicker on that quote-unquote mid-boss on PC Engine, which, again, a couple of hits and it's gone. In the arcade and Genesis ports, you are in for a fight on this thing. It is not easy. It moves around a lot, it shoots a lot, and it's tough to do this without getting killed. PC Engine CD Hellfire is sort of like Hellfire for dummies. Well, not so much Hellfire for dummies. More like training wheels or baby's first Hellfire. The point is, it's really easy compared to the other versions. And as we head into the next area, aside from the lack of parallax, everything is pretty accurate here. Are you sick of hearing those sound effects on the lasers from the PC Engine version yet? Man, it was tough for me to put up with that for the whole entire game. And this is another one where I feel like they really hurt the music. The music on the CD version, with its Redbook audio, just has the completely wrong feeling for this stage. It's not right, it doesn't have the energy of the arcade or Genesis versions. Sure, the instruments sound way better, there's no question about that, but the song itself and the changes they've made, overall I think make it much worse to listen to. Like, there's a lot of times I've sat down in the Genesis version and just put on the sound test and listened to the music. I would never listen to the PC Engine CD version outside of the game. I just don't like it. I think it is poorly done. And of course, that is going to be a matter of personal taste, as I have seen many people defend this soundtrack. I'll point out once again that the Starfield is a little simpler on PC Engine than the arcade version. Here comes mini-boss number 2. Even with just the one of these tiny little guys, there's a lot of flicker on PC Engine. And once again, they are super easy on PC Engine. And meanwhile, this is a really tough mini-boss on the Genesis and the arcade. Now, one other thing I'll mention about the PC Engine CD version, in case I haven't yet, is that it is 2 players simultaneous, just like the arcade. But if you think the flicker is bad on 1 player, it's even worse on 2 players, as you might expect. Another side effect of it being 2 players simultaneous on PC Engine is that when you die in that version, you will respawn right where you died, unlike the Genesis version. And did you see that on PC Engine? I mean, there's no excuse for that. The ships, the enemies, are just overlapping the background. They just go right through those rock outcroppings like they're not even there. So right at the beginning of this section. And this is another area where the lack of parallax really makes the PC Engine version look more like an NES game. They even drastically simplified the background pattern, which they simplified the pattern also on Genesis, but this one's even worse. And without the parallax, it's doubly worse. Once more, I'm pausing it on PC Engine CD because it's gotten slightly ahead of the arcade one. And there we're pretty close to parity again. I do find it kind of interesting they were able to get rid of the slowdown in both the Genesis and PC Engine Super CD ports of this game. Contemporary ports of the era didn't often get rid of slowdown from the arcade originals. Gameplay-wise, for the most part, PC Engine Hellfire does a decent job. It feels a lot like the arcade one, but it's not exactly perfect. Because we have some enemies that are different sizes, some of them the timing is a little off on, and things like that. The firing rate is the biggest difference, and unlike the Genesis version, which ups the firing rate and shrinks the laser size, here we've got larger lasers and a lower firing rate. And yep, as you imagine, just a few hits to take out the boss on PC Engine again. Meanwhile, in the arcade, we'll be scrapping against this thing for just a little bit. And there we are, he's taken down on both of them, and we move to a cutscene on PC Engine CD. Alright, here we are in stage 4. And you notice something wrong on the PC Engine version this time around? It's pretty noticeable. The foreground layer, with all the vines and stuff, it's behind everything. So if you look in the arcade one, if you move up or down, the foreground layer will obscure you or any enemies that are behind it, like the walkers there. Meanwhile, in this PC Engine port, everything is on top of the foreground layer. There's no difference in drawing the priorities for the sprites. Now, unlike the Genesis version, in which you could just completely destroy the walkers, on PC Engine, you do have to shoot out just their weapons, and they hang around like the arcade one. They drastically simplified the walking animation, and the legs just move rather than animate. In the arcade, they actually animate if you watch. They're also noticeably smaller on PC Engine. And much like the Genesis version, they've darkened the background a bit on PC Engine CD, but not as much. And as we head into this part, they've really drastically simplified the background here. They got rid of the foreground layer with the vines altogether. They could have still kept the vines and not had it be parallax, but nope, they're just totally gone. The tree pattern, which you can't even tell it's a tree pattern on PC Engine, it's just a bunch of dots. And the star field is much simpler on PC Engine than the arcade version. The volcano that comes up here, a little bit smaller on PC Engine and a whole lot of flicker if you let anything come out of it without blasting it immediately, pretty much. And I'll also be extra nitpicky here and point out that the stars that twinkle in the arcade version in the background do not twinkle in the PC Engine Super CD version. And the little things that hop out of the water, I mean, they're positioned a bit different on the PC Engine version. So you can't play this exactly the same way as you would in the arcade or Genesis port. The arcade and Genesis one, you can play this area pretty much identically, but not this version. And boy do I miss the real level 4 music and the soundtrack on the PC Engine version. The Egyptian level music here is just so out of place. You also notice that the bullets are a lot slower on the default difficulty mode here on PC Engine versus the default arcade difficulty. Now on PC Engine we've changed the tree background from grayish to reddish. Or brown, I don't know. Remember, I'm colorblind. It looks red to me. Now, at least the way these enemies emerge and their patterns are pretty close in the two versions here. Pretty much spot on. So good job on that, at least. And while I really enjoy Hellfire, I will point out one of the game's largest problems here, and that's that its 6 levels just go on for too long. This level feels like it should have ended like a minute ago. It really should have been broken down into maybe 2 levels where they changed the background midway through, but kept the enemy patterns that they used. Yeah, I think Hellfire would have worked a lot better if they maybe made it 9 levels long instead of 6, but reduced the length of especially the last 3 levels. Maybe the last 4 a little bit. Having each stage be a little more concise and maybe a little more focused on certain firing directions would have really helped this game out. And I will prepare you for the boss fight because guess what? Once we get up to it on the PC Engine version, it's going to be much easier than every other version of Hellfire. The only other thing I'll point out here again is the regular enemies and even the larger walkers are smaller on PC Engine than the arcade. Oh, and that level 2 music that they shoehorned into level 4 is just so bad on PC Engine CD. It doesn't fit at all. Alright, here's our boss fight. Oh, look at that, 2 of them are gone already before he even has a chance to fully form. And the large circular bullets are a lot slower in the PC Engine version, and there's way fewer of them. So they're very easy to deal with and dodge. In the arcade version and the Genesis ports, you're in for a tough fight on this boss. This may even be the toughest boss in the whole game in the arcade and Genesis versions. Almost got it here, won't be too much longer. Come on. There we are. Only 2 levels left. Alright, stage 5. The big things on the tracks are a lot less detailed on PC Engine than the arcade. If you remember in the Genesis port, they completely redesigned it. The background in the PC Engine version this time is very well done, and looks very close to the arcade even though it's not the same. They changed up some of the design a little bit. If you look at the arcade game, you can see there are different patterns and different ways that like the piping and tiles are laid out. A lot of that stuff is removed in the PC Engine port, and they went with sort of the simplest pattern and kept that one while getting rid of the more complicated patterns. This part on PC Engine is a big pain in the butt, because it's way easier to get hit by these little poles than it is in the arcade or Genesis versions. I think the primary reason for that is in the arcade and Genesis ports, they emerge a little bit more slowly at the start, so you have a split extra second to see them and move out of the way. In the PC Engine version, they don't do that. They just kind of move up while they're already flashing. They don't really accelerate. They just kind of start and then go real fast. Now, once again on PC Engine, because of all the slowdown in the arcade one, we've gotten a little bit ahead of it. And look at all the flicker on this part. The sprites haven't even emerged yet. Yeah, this part, on the Genesis, they added a whole different thing here with missiles that got fired at you. In the PC Engine version here, it's a lot closer to the arcade in terms of the enemy type, but there's way more flicker. And then this blue circuitry background, they've dramatically simplified it on PC Engine. They've once again made some of the colors a little more vibrant, and they've really simplified the background tiles, so there's a much smaller variety here on PC Engine CD than there is in the arcade original. What I mean by that is you can see the patterns repeat a lot more on PC Engine CD than they do in the arcade game. There's a lot more unique tiles in that one. And it's kind of disappointing whenever you see that, in a CD game. They had practically unlimited storage for this stuff. The only thing they had to deal with was, what could they hold in the console's RAM and VRAM and stuff. And clever programmers would be swapping out tiles on the fly and everything, so I just don't know why they didn't do that kind of stuff to make this as close as possible on this platform. Seems like kind of a waste. Alright, we're coming up to the next section here. There's going to be another area with those big machines that we have to blow the sensors off of. And it goes without saying, but the parallax scrolling on the rails is completely removed from the PC Engine port. This level doesn't have a ton of parallax in the arcade, so it comes off better on PC Engine than most of the other levels. Again, look at all that flicker, and again, this is just with one player. Now, as far as the music goes here, I'd say this is probably one of the better sounding songs in the PC Engine CD release. I feel like it better embodies the original intentions of the music than most of the other redone tracks for this version. Just because they're Red Book audio doesn't automatically make them good. But this one is good, unlike some of the others. Most of the other songs you can kind of tell the original is in it, but it doesn't feel like it's got the spirit of the original. This song does, so kudos to NEC for this one. As we head to the final section of the level here, it starts off quite a bit differently in both versions. They have basically more tiles of the same type just right there when you arrive on PC Engine, so you're not at the top of the thing, you're going into the middle of it. In the arcade, when you arrive, you're at the very top of the thing, and then go down to the bottom. So PC Engine, middle to bottom, arcade, top to bottom. Now, much like you saw me do in the Genesis version last time, you can just hang out at the bottom of the screen here and safely blow away the enemies that are going to come onto screen as it scrolls down. Also mentioned here, if you look closely, you can see they have simplified the tiles a little bit in the PC Engine CD version. There's sort of a wider part that tapers off to a thinner part on these pipes in the background, and they got rid of the wider part. Here's the boss, and yep, about 3 shots on PC Engine CD and it's dead. Arcade, we're going to have to put in a lot more effort, but we still get it. Still pretty easy. Here's our final cutscene before the end on PC Engine. Alright, and here is the final level in both games. And I'll say one more time, on PC Engine the foreground layer is a little too vibrant. And it's funny, in the Genesis version I thought the rocky background was a little too dull compared to the arcade version. This one is a little too bright compared to the arcade version. And the swirling nebulae in the backgrounds are a lot more simple on PC Engine. They're even more simplified than they were in the Genesis version. And the big ships we're fighting here, in the Genesis one, you actually destroy them. The PC Engine keeps it more similar to the arcade version, where you damage the weapon parts of them. The ships are a lot smaller on PC Engine than they are in the arcade original, however. And those ships on PC Engine are maybe 60% of the size of the arcade original. And you do get to a point where you can have a lot of them on the screen at once. Let me rephrase that. You can have a few of the ships on screen at once and a lot of bullets on screen with them. One other thing I will note for this level in particular is the difficulty in the PC Engine CD port really spikes here. It's a lot closer to the Genesis and arcade games in this level than any of the earlier levels. Which is kind of a really mean, bad design thing to do. If you want to keep the game easy, keep it easy. It's not good to make the whole game easy and then make the last level really hard. And as you can see, that ship is even a lot smaller in the PC Engine CD compared to the arcade game this time around for the second ship. Flicker City there on PC Engine CD. And if you've been watching the arcade game, you'll notice it never flickers even once. Meanwhile, like I've said a few times here, even on one-player mode, there is just a lot of flicker on PC Engine CD. And they've dramatically simplified this part that's coming up, and if you thought there was a lot of flicker on those ships, well, check out this section. Since the PC Engine only can do one background layer, it looks like they've decided to use sprites for the background here. So all those rocks are made of sprites, which is why there's so much flicker on this part. And yeah, this part on PC Engine is just about as hard as the arcade version of this part. Which is saying a lot considering how easy the PC Engine version has been up to this point. Now keep in mind you will come back and respawn wherever you died on the PC Engine port. So if you do get killed here, it's not quite as devastating as in, say, the Genesis port of the game. But the Genesis port of the game doesn't have that part, remember? It fires gigantic missiles at you instead, which I actually preferred. We're almost at the very final boss here, and without spoiling anything, guess what? It's super easy on PC Engine. Shocking, right? It's not like we've set a precedent for that or anything. But to be fair, this boss is a little bit easier than most in both the arcade and Genesis versions. Kind of strange considering it's the final boss of the game and all, but there you are. But yeah, look at the firing rate of these enemies on PC Engine. It was nothing like that earlier in the game. Here's our final boss. Ton of flicker on the PC Engine. Way more than any other version. And just a few hits and he's gone. We've almost got him in the arcade one too. think I've got one volley left to take care of him. Yep, there we are. And yep, that's Hellfire beaten on both the arcade and PC Engine Super CD. I hope you like long endings, because the ending in the CD version of Hellfire is super long. It might compete with Genesis Strider for one of the longest endings to an action game ever. But if you're worried that it's going to be long and pointless, well, don't worry. I mean, it is long and pointless, but it's nothing to worry about, right? If you don't know Japanese, this is not going to be the most entertaining thing in the world to watch, so you might want to just skip to my completion notes here and my final thoughts on these two games. If you want to stick around for the ending, I'll still chat about a few things. In fact, let's talk about the PC Engine CD version versus the Genesis version that we saw last week. So in Genesis Hellfire, it's a lot closer to the arcade one in terms of the feel of the game and the difficulty and everything. The biggest differences are that it's one player only on Genesis, which is a minus, and they changed the final few forms of the power-up laser, so the lasers are a little bit smaller and you can fire out more of them. So on the Genesis port, for that final form of the laser, you can shoot out 4 volleys of 3 beams at one time and have those on the screen simultaneously. So you can have a total of 12 shots on the screen. On the PC Engine, you can only have 3. In the arcade, you could have 6. That's for the forwards and backwards lasers. For the PC Engine CD, the diagonal and vertical lasers are closer to the arcade port than the Genesis version. But I do have to say I vastly prefer the smaller lasers and higher firing rate in the Genesis port of the game. On PC Engine, you fire that one long laser forward, and you're sitting there for like more than a second before you can fire again sometimes, because it doesn't let you do that until your full blast is completely off the screen. And I thought it was annoying in the arcade version being limited to the 6 blasts, but being limited to the 3, just in the single volley, that leaves your ship wide open to a whole bunch of attacks. Now, I don't know if they made the game easier to help compensate for that, or if they were just trying to lure in more casual players. And I just can't stress enough how disappointed I am with the soundtrack in this game. While I think the level 1 and level 6 songs are alright, I don't think they're very great, and I don't think they really capture the spirit of the energy of the arcade original. They're kind of laid back in this game. I mean, they're almost more elevator music-y, to use a term that I think would fit. They're just slow and they lack all energy. Meanwhile, in the Genesis versions of the game, I feel like the energy on some of these songs is actually ramped up a little bit. So I actually prefer the music in that one, even though it's chiptunes, compared to the Red Book audio in this one. So, TS Music, I'm sorry, but I don't think you did your job very well this time around. And sound effects, wow. Akihiro Saito, what were you thinking with those weird little Namco beepy boopy lasers? They work fine in something like Galaga or some cutesy shooter. Totally wrong for Hellfire. Totally wrong. Alright, that about wraps things up for the credits. So we'll finish things up here in just a moment. I'll give you my final thoughts on the PC Engine CD version of Hellfire. Oh, and one other thing missing from the PC Engine CD port. After you beat the game, that's it. You can't play another loop like you can in the arcade and Genesis versions. Alright, there we are, the full complete game of the arcade versus PC Engine Super CD version of Hellfire. This time around, I don't really think it's any contest. The arcade version is significantly better than this PC Engine Super CD port. Now, Super CD Hellfire It's an okay game and a decent port for the hardware, but they still could have done better. As I've mentioned now a few times, I find the music in this one completely inappropriate for the most part. It sounds like the soundtrack to a cheap 90s anime series and just doesn't have any energy. The low difficulty level, at least until the last stage of the game, makes PC Engine CD Hellfire just feel kinda slow and empty a lot of the time. The lack of any parallax scrolling gives it a very 8-bit feel for a shooter or shmup. The fairly high amount of flicker is very often noticeable and just detracts from the overall quality feeling of the game. If you're a fan of Hellfire, this version on the PC Engine Super CD is still worth checking out. But of the 3 major versions, Arcade, Genesis, and PC Engine Super CD, the Super CD version is definitely the worst. The only real advantage it has over the Genesis port is the 2-player mode. Anyway, what do you think? Now that you've seen 3 different versions of the game, tell me which one is your favorite in the comments and tell me why. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe for more retro gaming goodness. If you want to support the channel, you can now do that on Patreon or Ko-fi. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.